I still remember the day I left Arkansas to head to Iraq. The day I kissed Emma goodbye and promised to come back in one piece. In some way, it felt like a part of me remained in that living room, when I saw her standing in our distant doorway, smiling. And yet I already felt a quiet concern, like that heavy goodbye was hiding something more than just longing. But I pushed that feeling aside. Maybe it was just the nerves before my first long deployment playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a premonition of everything that was to come, something I never thought she was capable of. My name is Carter. I'm 28 years old, grew up in a small town in Arkansas, and have served as a military police officer in the U.S. Army. Growing up, my dad taught me the value of loyalty, of keeping your word, and of not deviating from what you believe in. I took that very seriously, even as a kid. In high school, I was never the coolest guy, but early on I got a reputation for being someone you could rely on. Then, as I got older, I set my sights on the military. Through basic training and further education, I found a place where loyalty, responsibility, and a sense of team spirit were central. It felt natural to continue on that path. Emma is my wife, well, she was my wife. She's 25 and originally from California. If I'm the calm, down-to-earth type, she's definitely my polar opposite. She's spontaneous, charming, and outgoing, the kind of person who always lights up a room when she walks in. We met at a college event in Texas. She was studying some sort of communications or media, I don't remember exactly. I was there for further training in military police work, on a recruitment mission. We ran into each other when I was setting up chairs in an auditorium, and Emma was going to help with decorations. Sparks flew right from the start. Something in her smile, in her gaze, made me feel different. It was as if we were the only two people on Earth in that moment, even though the auditorium was full of people. We started talking and didn't stop until late that same evening. It was the most natural thing I had ever experienced. We belonged together. After a few months of intense dating, lots of long phone calls, weekend trips between our different cities, and plenty of evenings filled with endless discussions about the future, we made the decision to get married. It was a kind of rush. We were young, in love, and convinced that nothing could stop us. We chose to do it right before I was about to start my first long deployment in Iraq. Maybe it was a romantic, if somewhat hasty, idea, but it felt right. We didn't want to waste any time. We wanted to build our future together, even though it would mean I'd be gone a lot. We bought a house near my family's farm in Arkansas. It was a pretty old property but sturdy, with a lot of land around it. Emma, who was used to California's densely populated areas, initially found it lonely. But I promised her there was something magical about having nature at your doorstep and a peaceful existence. She was willing to give it a try. And before I knew it, we were married, and I was about to leave her for 12 months in one of the world's most turbulent regions. Those first few months of marriage, before I left, were actually wonderful. We furnished the house, created routines, and enjoyed our newfound daily life. Emma being social and open was nicely balanced by my more reserved nature. We complemented each other. She often called her friends back in California, enthusiastically telling them how different it was to live in Arkansas. Sometimes she complained about the silence, but just as often she appreciated the beautiful sunsets that only an open, rural landscape can offer. Looking back now, I wish I could have frozen time. That the person she was then, and the happiness we shared, could have withstood everything that was to come. Because just a few weeks before I was supposed to leave, I started noticing a certain nervousness in Emma. It wasn't exactly strange, since we were both aware of the risks involved in a deployment. Yet sometimes I felt that her fear wasn't just about losing me, but also about not knowing how she would handle being alone. But I reassured her. I said, "We'll make it through this, Emma. The time will go by quickly. We'll talk on Skype, through letters and emails. And when I come home, we'll make up for everything." She used to smile when I said that, but her eyes looked worried. "I know," she would answer. "I trust you, Carter. I'm just scared of how everything will be when you're gone. I don't really know anyone here." Right then and there, I promised her solemnly that everything would be fine. That my family would be there for her if she needed anything. That Mrs. Johnson, our nearest neighbor, if you can call a house half a kilometer away a neighbor, was a kind old lady who was always happy to have a cup of coffee if she got the chance. Emma nodded, but the uncertainty never really left her face. My time in Iraq was tough, but as a military police officer, I learned to handle the pressure. What kept me going was the thought of Emma. Every time I went out on a mission, I thought of her and how I had to come home again. There really was no other option in my mind. I was focused, determined, and I knew she was waiting for me. We didn't exchange as many letters as I'd hoped, the internet connection was sometimes unreliable, and time was tight. but every time I got a message from her, I read it over and over again. Eventually, my return date approached, and my superiors told me we'd be coming home about a week earlier than planned. The joy I felt was immeasurable. The only thing I could think about was surprising Emma. I wouldn't say anything, just show up on our porch and see her face light up when she saw me. I prepared carefully, bought some gifts at the base, and hurried home via a route through Germany, then on to a larger U.S. airport, and finally took a domestic flight closer to Arkansas. Ultimately, I borrowed a car from my family to drive the last stretch. Driving along the winding dirt road leading up to our house, I felt my heart pounding with anticipation. Our house emerged in the twilight, with the yellow lights on. I got out of the car, parked it slightly behind the house so she wouldn't notice. Then I crept up to the door and took a deep breath before unlocking it with my own key. It was oddly quiet. I called out, "Emma? Honey, I'm home." I expected a squeal of delight, or at least the sound of rapid footsteps across the floor. But nothing happened. Eventually, I saw her in the kitchen doorway. Her expression was shocked. And what surprised me more than the shock was that her eyes lacked the warmth I was used to seeing. She stammered, "Carter? What? How?" I smiled broadly and went over to hug her. But she hugged me stiffly, not even listening to my explanations about why I'd come home early. I couldn't help asking, "Aren't you happy to see me?" She mumbled something about being surprised that I'd come so suddenly. But there was something in her voice that felt off. Her body language seemed closed off. It wasn't the reunion I had imagined during my time away. Instead of a passionate embrace, I got a cold shoulder, and when I gently took her hand, she felt so distant. That night was tumultuous. I tried to talk about my last mission, about the tough days and how I just wanted to relax now that I was home. I looked for her gaze, searching for confirmation that she was relieved and happy. But her eyes darted around. She avoided my closeness in a way that made my insides ache. Something was wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. I cautiously asked if she was okay, if something had happened. She just shrugged and said, "I'm fine. I'm just tired." Then she went to sleep in the guest room. Or well, what used to be the guest room. I asked why, and she just gave an evasive reply, "I don't want to disturb your sleep, you must be exhausted from traveling." It was the strangest behavior I'd ever seen from her. Emma, who had always been so hungry for physical closeness and so spontaneous, suddenly didn't even want to share a bed with me, her husband, now home after almost a year away. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach as I lay alone in our bedroom. The joy I'd felt before had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that maybe Emma just needed time to get used to having me back. That she had developed her own routines and perhaps felt invaded when I suddenly showed up. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, and not in a good way. One morning, as I stood in the bathroom shaving, I suddenly noticed an extra toothbrush. I stared at it for a long time. I was 100% sure it wasn't mine. I had used mine that same morning, and besides, it was a completely different color and shape. I recognized Emma's toothbrush, pink and worn out. But this one was green, relatively new, and placed in a mug next to Emma's. I frowned. It felt wrong. When I asked Emma about the toothbrush later that day, she just snorted and said, "I bought the wrong toothbrush once and left it there. It's nothing weird." But the way she brushed me off was almost aggressive. She snapped before I'd even finished the question. That same day, in the afternoon, I needed to borrow her car keys to go buy some groceries. When I went to our key rack in the hallway, I saw a key ring for a car brand I'd never seen before. A brand I didn't even recognize from our circle of friends. I picked it up, turned it over and over. Why did Emma have a key to a car that neither she nor I owned? I asked her about that too, but she shrugged nonchalantly and said, "A friend of mine forgot it here a few days ago. He's coming to pick it up." It was the way she said he that made my insides tense. I knew Emma could have male friends, that in itself wasn't strange. But she usually told me about them, she was sociable, and I knew most of the people she spent time with. Now, though, total silence. I had never heard of this friend. Then there were other, less obvious clues. The throw pillows on the living room couch were so plumped up they looked like they had been used as headrests. There was an empty cigarette pack in the trash, which was very odd because neither I nor Emma smoked. I also noticed that she often seemed to hide her phone when I suddenly walked into the room. If I happened to glance at the screen, she got annoyed, as if I were intruding on her privacy. I recognized my own reaction as a military police officer. I was almost unconsciously starting to gather mental evidence. After a few days of this strange atmosphere, I could no longer ignore my gut feeling. Maybe I was paranoid, but I was also trained to see and read details. It was both a curse and a blessing, that side of me that was a military cop. I decided to proceed systematically, without directly confronting Emma with accusations just yet. I needed evidence, or at least a clearer picture of what was really going on. First, I went through our household's financial transactions. With my experience, I had no trouble getting an overview of our accounts. Immediately, I saw unusual expenses, double grocery purchases, payments that seemed to indicate trips Emma had never mentioned. There were hotel costs in cities I didn't recognize, and I quietly wondered why on earth she would stay in a hotel if she lived in our house. All these transactions occurred while I was away, and she had never mentioned any of them. I knew Emma didn't usually travel much on her own, especially not without saying anything. It was simply strange. Then, one of the days when Emma was out buying a few things in town, I went out on the porch and found clear footprints in the dirt. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft. The prints were bigger than mine. I placed my shoe next to them and saw that they didn't match at all. They reappeared in multiple places, as if someone had been walking around the porch on a regular basis. A cold shiver ran through me. Who on earth walked around our house when I wasn't here? Was it some random visitor, or was someone actually living here? I called our neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, a kind older lady who had lived in the area forever. She usually kept track of who came and went along our road, not really out of gossip, more because she was alone and curious about everything that happened. I asked if she had seen anything unusual while I was gone. She fell silent at first. Then she said, "Well, Carter. Emma often had company at home. But I didn't want to interfere. I know how hard it can be to be alone." Her voice was cautious, but I still heard the hint of sympathy and perhaps a little sadness. I wanted to ask more detailed questions, but I realized she had probably already said more than she was comfortable with. I thanked her for her honesty and hung up. Inside me, a panicked realization grew. Emma had had regular company. And everything pointed to it being a man who smoked and had a different car. It took me a couple of days to gather the courage to ask the right questions and look for more concrete evidence. In a situation like this, it's easy to want to bury your head in the sand. You hope you're wrong. You think you're overreacting. But I could no longer avoid the truth. Everything was screaming at me that something was very wrong. I found pictures on Emma's phone. It sounds like an invasion of privacy, but in our marriage, up until now, we hadn't kept secrets. We knew each other's passwords, we had shared accounts and all that. One evening while she was asleep, I went into her phone. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. I found pictures of Emma with another man. They were laughing, hugging each other, they seemed intimately connected. I also found pictures that suggested he had actually been staying in our house, at least during certain periods. I saw pictures in our living room, in our kitchen, and even selfies taken in our bed, the bed Emma and I shared when I was home. I found pictures of her naked, lying on her back with her legs around someone's waist, taken by that person. My blood ran cold as I scrolled through the images. I felt anger, sorrow, confusion, all at once. I was also devastated, realizing she'd been with this man almost the whole time I was in Iraq, while I lay sleepless in a military barracks, longing for her. How long had she planned this? Or had it just happened? I tried to breathe calmly, but I could hardly manage it. I put the phone down and felt my entire world collapse. The next day, I called an acquaintance of Emma's, a woman named Sarah, whom I knew Emma hung out with now and then. I wanted to know if she was aware of this situation. Sarah tried to evade my questions at first, but when I explained how things stood and that I'd seen the evidence, she gave in and told me, "Carter, I'm sorry. I didn't want to say anything. Emma threatened me, or no, she asked me not to get involved. But she's been in a relationship with a guy named Mark. I think they met at a bar in town several months ago. Then he basically moved into your house sometimes. I don't know exactly how often." The weight in my chest then is hard to describe. I thanked Sarah for her honesty. Then I just sat in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, staring into space for what must have been half an hour without moving. Memories came flooding back of how I'd pictured coming home, how I daydreamed about carrying Emma across the threshold, embracing her like in a romantic movie. Now I sat here, knowing a stranger had literally taken my place in my home. With the evidence at hand, the pictures, the transaction history, and the testimony from Sarah, plus Mrs. Johnson's hints, I felt strong enough to face Emma. At the same time, I was completely numb inside. There were no words that could make me understand why she did this. All I felt was immense rage, a crushing sadness, and a sense of worthlessness, like I hadn't been enough for her. On the 7th day after my return, I waited until she came back from one of her mysterious errands in town. She saw me sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of papers and phone pictures laid out. When she walked into the room, she went pale. I asked her to sit down. She reluctantly did so. I began calmly, though my voice shook. I showed her the bank statements, pointed out the hotel expenses and grocery stores. I told her about Mrs. Johnson's hints. I brought out the pictures I had found on her phone. At first, she defended herself, denied it, and yelled that I had invaded her privacy. But her voice was drowned out by the undeniable evidence. I pointed to a picture from our bed where she was next to Mark, now that I knew his name. Her face was rigid. In the end, there was no turning back. She admitted it. Emma broke down in tears, saying she had been lonely and lost, and that Mark showed up when she was at her worst. She said she couldn't handle my absence, that she needed closeness. I just sat there, silent, with a pounding anger in my chest. How could she? She knew what I'd been through. We had gotten married under the promise that we would be there for each other. I thought about all the letters I wrote her from Iraq, all the times I daydreamed about coming home, all the times I risked my life on duty with only one vision in mind, to return to my wife. And she couldn't wait for me. Then came the blow. I want a divorce, she said outright. She explained that she wanted to continue being with Mark, or at least intended to move on with her life without me. I could hardly believe my ears. It was one thing that she'd been unfaithful, a huge shock in itself, but now she was sitting here telling me she wanted to leave me. It felt like a slap in the face. All I felt was disgust. The thought of her and Mark in the same bed, in my home, made me want to puke. Finally, I turned to her and said, "Fine. Then let's do it. Leave the house. I don't want you here." She started packing her things that very evening. It's strange how quickly everyday life can fall apart. A week earlier, I had come home from Iraq, full of longing for my wife. Now, I just wanted her out of the house, out of my life. Her tears fell, but in my eyes there was no mercy. All I felt was betrayal and contempt. As she drove away, she cast one last glance at me through the side window. I stood in the doorway, just as stiff and cold as she'd been when I came home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt both guilt and relief, sorrow and terrible anger. Maybe I should have begged her to stay, tried to save the marriage? But how could I ever trust her again, when she had already broken everything we stood for? 3 weeks passed after that night. During that time, I managed to contact a lawyer and start the divorce process. It was a formality, but it also felt like the final nail in the coffin for my dreams of a happy marriage. I tried to fill the days with exercise and job hunting. It went slowly, but at least it was something to distract me. I avoided alcohol, even though it was tempting to drink away the pain. I knew nothing in the world could dull the wound Emma had inflicted on me. Somewhere inside, I might have hoped she would call to apologize, not that I would forgive her, but just to put everything behind me. But the phone stayed silent, and that was probably for the best. The only one who contacted me occasionally was my mom, who knew what had happened. She said she was sorry, that she never thought Emma was like that. I agreed, but clearly everything was different now. Then one late night, as I was sitting in front of the TV staring blankly at the screen, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I peeked out the window and saw a black car I didn't recognize. To my surprise, the door opened and Emma got out. Her hair was disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. She wore the same clothes I'd seen her in once before, but they were wrinkled, like she hadn't cared about anything for the past few days. I opened the door and met her in the hallway. She stood there on the verge of tears, saying she needed to talk to me. She said she was sorry, that everything got messed up. When I asked her outright where Mark was, if they weren't together anymore, I saw her go silent. Her eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't have to say it out loud, he had left her. Her voice was broken as she asked for another chance. She said she made a mistake, that she realized what she had lost. A mistake? One that lasted for several months and involved him practically living here? And now that she didn't get her way with Mark, I was supposed to be some kind of backup plan? I stared at her. For a moment, memories washed over me, the life we had imagined, the vows we had exchanged, my love for her. But just as quickly, the memory of all those nights in Iraq when I longed for home, unaware that my home was no longer mine, returned. I shook my head. "You're not welcome here," I said in a calm voice. "There's nothing left for us, Emma. This is over." She tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. "Stop. You betrayed me while I was gone. You let another man move in here. And now that he's dumped you, you think you can crawl back and pretend nothing happened? If you ever cared about me, just leave me alone now." Tears streamed down her face. She said she loved me, that she had always loved me. I smiled sadly. If you had loved me, you never would have done this, I said. I risked my life for my country, I risked my life for us. You threw all that away. I'm not your backup plan. She asked me to at least let her explain more, but I didn't need to hear any more. I was already shattered. No explanation in the world could ever make me trust her again. I opened the door and told her to leave. She stood there for a moment, sobbing and stammering. Please, Carter. She began. But I shook my head and said, Goodbye, Emma. With that, I closed the door on her and heard her sobs gradually fade as she walked down the steps. The car engine started, and its headlights disappeared down the dirt road. I remained there in the hallway, completely still, my heart pounding. It felt like a final period on a story that had begun so beautifully but ended in betrayal and destruction. When the divorce finally went through, it felt strangely both painful and liberating. It was as if a long, agonizing chapter had come to an end. I'll probably always wonder what drove Emma to do what she did. Was it loneliness? Something that had always been inside her before we even got married, a restlessness she couldn't tame? Or was it my own naivete, not realizing how vulnerable our marriage was? Either way, I've learned that life doesn't always follow the plans we make when we're young. I've realized that loyalty isn't always mutual, that sometimes love fades or gets replaced by something else. Even though I'm deeply hurt, I try not to bury myself in bitterness. I've reconnected with old friends, considered more schooling, and am thinking about starting my own business in the security sector. My family has supported me through all of this, and I know I'm not alone. I'm still living in the house. I considered selling it, since all the memories of Emma initially made it unbearable to stay here. But over time, it feels more and more like my own home, and the memory of her fades. I'm the one who sits on the couch now, without any oddly fluffed up pillows. I'm the one who sleeps in the bed, without worrying about secret guests. Every time I step out onto the porch, I think about those large footprints in the dirt, a symbol of another man's presence in my life. But rain and wind have long since washed them away, just as I hope time will wash away the scars inside me. I'll never forget those nights in Iraq when I imagined coming home to a wife who was longing for me. And I'll never forget the icy feeling when I realized the dream had turned into a play of betrayal. But maybe it's the pain itself that teaches us the most about who we are and what we want. I'm still Carter, I'm still that same guy from Arkansas who values honesty and family. But I've learned that not everyone understands those values in the same way. Today, several months later, I wonder if I'll ever love someone again with the same innocent devotion. Maybe not. Maybe I'll be more careful, more suspicious. But I hope that one day I can learn to trust another person again, to open my heart anew when I'm ready. Because life doesn't end just because a relationship does, no matter how devastating it may feel in the moment. We keep breathing, keep waking up in the morning, and keep finding ways to move on. Emma no longer shows up here. I only hear rumors that she might have moved back to California, that she might be trying to piece her life back together. I don't wish her ill, but I know I never want to see her again. The betrayal was too great, and my self-esteem won't allow me to be anyone's second choice.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.